My name is Loretta Miller. I'm 71 years old and I spent nearly my entire life working as an accountant at a major firm. After my husband passed, I was left alone in our large home in Georgia. That's when the relatives started circling. They gently suggested I was too old to live alone, that maybe I needed supervision, that perhaps selling the house would be best. For the good of the family. They thought they knew better. They thought I'd quietly go along with their plan. But I had my own answer, and believe me, it's one they won't forget anytime soon. If this story resonated with your soul, click subscribe and let me know in the comments which city or country you're listening from. I'm truly curious to know where you're tuning in from. My name is Loretta Miller, and I was 71 years old when I realized that peace had become my greatest treasure. I lived in a sturdy, time-worn house just outside of Savannah, Georgia, tucked behind towering oaks draped in Spanish moss. The house had been mine and Frank's, bought when we were young enough to believe we had all the time in the world. After he passed, it had become solely mine, a quiet guardian of memories and seasons gone by. My days were soft and simple, unfolding like the pages of an old novel read one careful chapter at a time. I woke early, long before the town began to stir, savoring the hush of the world before the first delivery trucks rattled down the main street and the church bells tolled the hour. I made my coffee strong and black, the way Frank had liked it, and sat out on the front porch wrapped in a shawl, listening to the slow symphony of morning, birds greeting the day, the soft whisper of the river wind threading through the trees. There was a slowness to life that suited me now. I was no longer bound by deadlines, no longer ruled by schedules or alarms. My career as a corporate accountant had demanded sharpness and precision for decades, but now the only figures I calculated were the number of tomatoes ripening in my modest backyard garden or the days until the next full moon. Every corner of the house held echoes of a life fully lived. The living room walls were lined with books, novels, poetry, biographies of people long gone. My rocking chair sat in the corner by the window, where afternoon light painted golden rectangles on the floor. The kitchen smelled perpetually of cinnamon and coffee, the old stove humming gently when I cooked my modest meals. The floors creaked underfoot in familiar ways, and even the drafty windows offered a kind of comfort, singing their quiet songs when the coastal wind picked up. Neighbors passed by occasionally on their morning walks, waving and calling out greetings. They knew me well enough to smile, but not well enough to pry. I liked it that way. My solitude wasn't loneliness. It was a soft, deliberate choice. It was freedom. I spent my afternoons tending the garden Frank and I had started decades ago. The roses were stubborn, refusing to bloom properly some years, but the lavender grew wild and defiant along the fence. Tomatoes climbed trellises. Green beans tangled themselves into knotted dreams, and herbs flourished in old chipped pots. I found a deep, satisfying peace in digging my hands into the earth, coaxing life from the soil, harvesting small rewards that tasted sweeter for the labor they required. Evenings were for reading or knitting, for simple dinners eaten by the window where I could watch the sunset ignite the sky in fiery oranges and pinks. Sometimes I would take long walks through the neighborhood just as the streetlights flickered on, the air thick with the scent of jasmine and damp earth. I loved the way the world looked in those moments, half-shadowed, full of mystery and memory. There was a rhythm to my life, an ease I had earned with years of hard work, heartbreak, resilience, and quiet perseverance. I wasn't rich, but I had enough. Enough to fix a leaky roof when needed, enough to fill the pantry and keep the lights on, enough to donate to the library fund each Christmas. Most importantly, I had enough space around me to breathe, to think, to remember who I was outside of the roles I had played for others. I knew, of course, that my life seemed strange to some people, that there were those who saw an older woman living alone and thought of sadness, of abandonment, of something broken. But they didn't understand. They didn't know that in every moment of solitude, I found strength, that in every quiet evening, I rediscovered parts of myself long buried beneath the noise and demands of life. I had no desire to fill my days with busyness for the sake of appearances. I had no need to be surrounded by people who only half listened, half cared. I had learned to savor my own company, to find joy in the smallest details. A well-tended plant, the slow drift of clouds across a blue sky, the way my cat, Oliver, curled into the crook of my arm each night without fail. It wasn't a perfect life. There were days when the loneliness crept in like a cold draft under the door, whispering doubts into the corners of my mind. There were nights when the ache of missing Frank was sharper than others, when memories flickered too vividly to ignore. But even then, even in those raw moments, I chose to see the beauty in what remained. I was alive. I was independent. I was whole, even in my solitude. And for me, that was enough. In the world outside my little bubble, life moved faster and louder. Friends I had known for years talked about retirement communities, about downsizing, about how difficult it was to manage a house alone. Some urged me to consider moving closer to family, to surrender the burden of independence for the comfort of care. I smiled politely, nodded at their well-meaning suggestions, but inside I felt a steady, unshakable certainty. This life, this simple, honest, quiet life, was not something I endured. It was something I had chosen, and I intended to keep choosing it for as long as I could draw breath. It started with the calls, innocent enough at first. A niece I had not heard from in months suddenly ringing me on a Tuesday morning, her voice sweet and overly bright, asking how I was managing on my own. Then a second cousin dropping by unannounced with a pie I knew she had bought at the grocery store, offering a brittle smile as she glanced around my living room as if assessing its value. These small interruptions, at first spaced weeks apart, began to cluster, creeping into my peaceful life like ivy growing through cracks in the foundation. The questions always came wrapped in concern, soft and syrupy, but their edges were sharp if you listened closely. Wasn't it lonely, living all by myself in such a big house? Hadn't I thought about moving into a community where people could keep an eye on me? Did I feel safe here, so far from town, so far from immediate help if something, God forbid, should happen? I would smile, offering polite reassurances, steering the conversations back to safer, shallower waters. I would comment on the weather, on the garden, on the upcoming town festival. I refused to acknowledge the true nature of their visits, but inside, a slow simmering unease began to grow. It wasn't just concern, it was calculation. I saw it in the way their eyes flickered across the old grandfather clock Frank had restored by hand, the way they lingered a moment too long on the antique sideboard in the dining room, the way they asked, so casually, if I had ever thought about what I might do with all this space if living here became too much. They were staking claims without even waiting for the ground to be cleared. The worst part was how expertly they disguised it, how they wrapped their greed in layers of faux affection. They brought small gifts, store-bought cookies, cheap potted plants, holiday cards signed with love but no real warmth. They asked about my health, feigning shock at my continued vigor, as if they had already rehearsed my frailty in their minds. I began to dread the ring of the doorbell, the beep of a new voicemail. I found myself hesitating before answering, peering through the window to see who was calling, weighing whether the emotional toll of another conversation was worth the effort of getting up from my chair. I wasn't naive. I knew that aging in America was often seen less as a stage of life and more as a burden to be managed, an inconvenience to be tucked away neatly. But I had not expected the people who once bounced on my knee and begged for extra cookies to turn so easily into vultures circling a future they thought they could claim. The final straw came one Sunday afternoon when my nephew Kevin arrived with a woman I had never met. His wife's friend, he said, a senior living consultant. She carried brochures and glossy pamphlets printed with smiling faces and manicured lawns, offering promises of care, companionship, peace of mind. Kevin smiled too much as he handed me one of the pamphlets, speaking in the slow, careful tone usually reserved for confused patients and stubborn children. He mentioned, almost as an afterthought, how the value of the property had skyrocketed recently, how I could do so much with the money from selling the house, how it would set me up comfortably for years to come. I stood there, pamphlet limp in, my hand feeling the blood hum in my ears. It wasn't about me. It had never been about me. It was about the house, about the money, about easing their own discomfort at the idea of an old woman living independently, outside of their control, beyond their reach. I thanked them for their visit, my voice calm and even, and ushered them politely out the door. I smiled as Kevin pressed a business card into my palm, smiled as the consultant chirped about available openings, smiled as the car pulled out of the driveway and disappeared down the street. And then I locked the door behind them, leaned against it, and let the smile slide from my face like a mask finally too heavy to wear. They had made their position clear, and now, so would I. I spent that evening sitting on the porch, a blanket draped over my knees, watching the sun dip low behind the trees. The air smelled of rain and wet earth, and somewhere a nightbird called out, lonely and defiant. I sipped my tea slowly, feeling the familiar weight of the house at my back, the creaking wood, the settling stone, the bones of a life built with patience and care. This was mine, not a prize to be divided, not a relic to be liquidated. Mine. They thought they could pressure me into handing it over, into surrendering the independence I had carved out for myself one long, hard year at a time. They were wrong. They didn't realize that the years had not worn me down. They had tempered me. I was not fragile. I was not broken. I was not waiting to be saved or tucked away somewhere safe and silent. I was watching. I was remembering. I was planning. And soon I would show them just how capable an old woman could be when pushed too far. In the days that followed Kevin's visit, the tone of the calls and drop-ins shifted in subtle but unmistakable ways. The facade of casual concern cracked, revealing glimpses of something colder and more calculating underneath. My phone rang more often now, not with cheerful greetings or genuine conversation, but with thinly veiled interrogations wrapped in the sticky sweetness of supposed love. They always began the same way, with a question that sounded innocent enough. Was I eating well? Was I getting enough rest? Did I feel lonely? Wasn't it exhausting maintaining a big old house all by myself? Each inquiry delivered in a syrupy tone, each laced with an undercurrent of expectation that I would agree, that I would surrender, that I would finally admit that they were right. I learned quickly to hear what wasn't being said, that their questions were not born from sleepless nights spent worrying about me. They were strategic, designed to plant seeds of doubt, to make me second-guess the very life I had fought to build. It was a campaign disguised as concern, a steady erosion disguised as affection. Visits became performances, carefully choreographed plays where smiles stretched too wide, laughter came too easily, and every conversation circled back to the same themes: safety, practicality, family responsibility. I could almost see the script in their minds, see the moments where they reminded themselves to look sympathetic, to lean in with furrowed brows, to sigh heavily as if the weight of caring for me was something they would bear heroically. And always underneath it all, the unspoken truth throbbed like a hidden wound. The house, the money, the inheritance they had already begun to count. It was not enough for them that I should be safe. I needed to be manageable, relocated, removed from the center of my own life so they could step into the spaces I would leave behind. I saw through it all with a clarity that startled me. I had spent years believing the best of people, excusing slights, forgiving thoughtlessness, explaining away selfishness. I had loved fiercely and generously, giving second and third chances long after they had been squandered. But now, stripped of illusions, I saw the truth shining through every polite smile and every empty embrace. They didn't want me to be happy. They wanted me to be convenient. They didn't want me to live well. They wanted me to quietly make way for their plans. I watched them closely during their visits, the way a scientist might observe a specimen. I noticed the quick flicker of irritation when I answered their questions with cheerful defiance, the tightness around their mouths when I spoke with pride about my garden or my solitary adventures into town. I saw how their eyes darkened when I mentioned a new project I had taken on, how they struggled to conceal their impatience when I laughed and said I had no intention of leaving my home. They spoke of love often, too often. They layered their words with thick sentimentality, telling me how much I meant to them, how they only wanted the best for me, how hard it was to think of me all alone. They embraced me longer than necessary, squeezing my shoulders as if trying to transmit their urgency through their fingertips. But love, real love, does not come with terms and conditions. Real love does not manipulate. Real love does not circle like a hawk, waiting for weakness. I listened politely. I nodded in all the right places. I accepted their hugs and their casseroles and their invitations to Sunday brunch. But inside, I was stepping back, pulling away, reclaiming the ground I had once surrendered too easily. They thought they could guilt me into compliance. They thought they could soften me with feigned tenderness. They thought that by smiling wide enough, by calling often enough, by pretending hard enough, they could convince me to give them what they wanted. But I had spent too many nights lying awake, staring at the ceiling, feeling the empty ache of a life devoted to others who no longer remembered or cared. I had spent too many years measuring my worth by how much of myself I could give away. I was done performing gratitude for attention that came with a price tag, done pretending that manipulation wrapped in love was anything but betrayal, done shrinking myself to fit the roles they had assigned me. I would not confront them. That would only give them a chance to spin new narratives, to cast me as ungrateful, confused, or, worst of all, senile. They were ready for that. I could see it in the way they exchanged glances behind my back, the way they spoke in low, pitying tones when they thought I wasn't listening. No, I would not fight their script. I would simply write my own. One evening, after they had all gone home, leaving behind half-eaten pies and polite promises to check in soon, I stood in the living room, feeling the house breathe around me, strong and silent and enduring. I placed my hands flat against the walls, feeling their steadiness pulse back at me. This was my home, my life, my choice, and they would not take it from me with smiles and whispered lies. Not now, Not ever. It did not happen in a rush of anger or in the middle of a heated argument. My decision was born the way most real changes are born, slowly in silence, taking root deep inside my chest until one day I simply knew. It settled into me like the sunrise, sure and steady and unstoppable. I realized, sitting alone on my front porch one humid afternoon, that no grand confrontation would change the way they saw me. They had already decided I was too old to make good decisions, too fragile to defend what was mine, too vulnerable to resist their subtle encroachments. They had built their narrative, and they needed me to fit into it so they could feel justified in their plans. Nothing I said would unmake the picture they had already painted in their minds. So I decided I would not argue. I would act. It began with small steps, invisible to anyone not paying close attention. I pulled out the thick, worn ledger where I kept the details of the house. Mortgage paid off years ago, taxes up to date, insurance in place. I reviewed every document carefully, as I had done for years during tax season, my old accountant habits snapping into place with comforting precision. I contacted my lawyer, Mr. Finch, a man I had trusted for decades, and asked for a meeting. We sat in his modest office, papers stacked neatly around us, the soft ticking of a wall clock the only sound as I explained my intentions. He listened without interruption, nodding occasionally, his pen moving swiftly across his notepad. He did not question my choice. He knew me better than that. I told him I wanted to sell the house, not because I was scared, not because I was desperate, because it was mine to sell, because I refused to let it be pried from my hands when I was no longer here to defend it. We discussed options, protections, ways to ensure that the money, my money, would remain safely and solely in my control. I did not want to leave behind a battleground for people who had mistaken proximity for entitlement. I wanted freedom. I wanted peace. And I wanted the satisfaction of knowing that when the time came, they would find nothing left to scramble over, nothing left to take. After the meeting, I drove home with the windows rolled down, letting the heavy summer air whip through the car. I felt lighter than I had in months. Not giddy, not triumphant, just clean, as if I had finally scrubbed away a lingering film of anxiety that had clouded every thought. Back at home, I began the practical work. I made lists of what I would keep and what I would sell. I contacted a realtor, a sharp, efficient woman named Angela, who respected my privacy and my insistence on discretion. She handled everything with the professionalism I demanded, listing the house quietly, showing it only to serious buyers, weaving the story of a beloved home ready for its next chapter. I packed in the evenings when the house grew quiet and the shadows stretched long across the floors. Each item I wrapped in newspaper and tucked into boxes was a silent declaration of autonomy. I chose what to take and what to leave, what to carry into my new life, and what to leave behind like a shed skin. I did not tell anyone. There were no hints dropped over Sunday dinners, no casual remarks during phone calls. I lived my days exactly as I had before, tending my garden, visiting the market, waving to neighbors on my morning walks. I kept the mask of normalcy firmly in place, the same way they had worn theirs. They would not see it coming. That thought didn't bring me malice or satisfaction. It brought me relief, because the decision was not about them. It was about reclaiming the agency they had tried to chip away from me with their faux concerned smiles and whispered manipulations. It was about stepping out of the story they had written for me and writing my own. The house sold quickly, as I had known it would. The buyers were a young couple, full of plans and dreams, their faces glowing with the kind of hope only the very young can wear so openly. I liked them immediately. They saw the house for what it was, a home, not a prize. I accepted their offer without hesitation. On the day we finalized the sale, I signed the papers with a steady hand, feeling the final weight of that quiet decision settle into place. It felt like exhaling after holding my breath for years. I arranged for the moving truck. I found a small, beautiful apartment closer to the coast, a place where the windows opened wide to the sea breeze and the sunset spilled gold and crimson across the sky every evening. I transferred the money into a private account under my name only, shielded by legal protections that no amount of pleading or guilt could penetrate. It was done, and they had no idea. They still called, still dropped by, still sent cards and pies and invitations to brunch, still played their parts with practiced ease. I let them. I smiled and nodded and made small talk, tucking my secret into the pocket of my heart like a precious stone. I had made my choice. I had drawn my line. And soon, when they reached for me, they would find nothing but the ghost of the woman they thought they could control. The news broke in the smallest, simplest way, as most real earthquakes in life do. It wasn't a confrontation or a tearful admission. It wasn't the result of careful planning or a dramatic reveal. It was an overheard comment at the farmer's market, floating lightly between two women who stood at the jam stall, chatting about the neighborhood. "Did you hear?" one of them said, her voice low but carrying just enough to reach me as I selected tomatoes from a wooden crate. "The old Miller house is sold. Some young couple bought it. They're moving in next month." I didn't react outwardly. I didn't startle or drop my basket. I kept my hands steady, selecting one firm red tomato after another, my heart thrumming a quiet, satisfied rhythm beneath my ribs. I hadn't realized how much I needed someone else to say it out loud. The Miller house, sold, gone. It was real now, not just a decision sealed away in paperwork and bank accounts, but a living fact weaving itself into the fabric of the town's gossip and casual conversation. I completed my shopping, made my way home along the familiar streets, and sat on my porch with a glass of iced tea, letting the weight of the moment settle into me like a second skin. It felt right. It felt inevitable. And most of all, it felt like freedom. The real ripple came a few days later when Kevin showed up unannounced. I saw his car pull up from my perch in the rocking chair, the way his tires crunched a little too quickly over the gravel, the way he got out of the car with a purposeful, almost hurried stride. He carried himself like a man who thought he was walking into a room where he held all the answers. I let him knock once, twice, before I opened the door. He smiled broadly, too broadly, the kind of smile people wear when they are about to ask for something they know they do not deserve. He stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, his eyes scanning the room automatically, looking for what? Signs of frailty, chaos, weakness? He would find none of that here. He launched into small talk, speaking about the weather, about his kids, about work. His words tumbled over one another, eager and meaningless. I listened with polite detachment, nodding when appropriate, feeling a strange calm bloom within me. And then, as expected, he steered the conversation to the house. He mentioned that he had driven by recently. How strange it was, he said, to see a for sale sign gone and the lawn trimmed within an inch of its life. He tried to laugh, but it came out tight and uncertain. He said he assumed there had been some mistake, that maybe I had leased the house or hired someone to help. I smiled softly and told him the truth in the gentlest voice I could manage. The house was sold. I had moved. It was done. For a moment, he simply stared at me, blinking as if he hadn't heard correctly. Then his mouth opened and closed once, twice, before words finally spilled out in a jumble. questions wrapped in disbelief, protestations thick with poorly concealed anger. How could I sell the family home? Why hadn't I consulted anyone? Didn't I realize what a mistake I had made? I sat there, hands folded neatly in my lap, letting his panic wash over me without touching me. I owed him no explanations. I owed him no reassurances. I owed him nothing at all. When he finally ran out of breath, I spoke quietly, simply. It was my house. It was my choice. It was my life. I watched the realization settle over him like a heavy fog, dimming the gleam of ambition in his eyes. He understood then, truly understood, that the prize he and the others had been circling had slipped away, not stolen from under their noses, but given away by the only person who had ever truly owned it. He made a few half-hearted attempts to salvage the conversation after that, tossing out platitudes about wanting what was best for me, about being concerned for my well-being, about keeping the family together. But the words rang hollow, brittle, and false. The mask had slipped, and I was no longer willing to pretend I couldn't see the truth beneath it. After he left, I sat in the quiet for a long time, feeling the tremble of adrenaline fade from my fingers, replaced by a steady, grounded peace. There would be more calls, I knew, more drop-ins, more thinly veiled accusations cloaked in concern. But it didn't matter. They could not undo what had been done. They could not reach into the spaces I had claimed for myself and tear them away. I had chosen my freedom. I had acted on my own terms. And now, as the late afternoon light spilled across the porch and the scent of fresh-cut grass drifted on the breeze, I knew with absolute certainty that there was no going back. In the days that followed Kevin's visit, I noticed the shift almost immediately. The phone calls became more frequent, more urgent. There were more knocks on my door, more text messages blinking across my phone screen, demanding answers they felt entitled to. But I had already decided I was not going to offer explanations. I was not going to justify my choices to people who saw me only as a sum of my assets, a fading character in the play of their lives. The first few calls I ignored completely, letting them roll to voicemail where their voices piled up one after another, sharp with frustration, brittle with feigned concern. "Just checking on you," they would say. "We're all so confused. We're worried. Please call us back." I listened to none of them to the end. I had no interest in hearing their carefully constructed speeches, no patience left for their hurt feelings when they had never once asked about mine. I spent my days quietly and deliberately, moving through the routines that grounded me. I walked along the beach at dawn, the cold sand biting at my bare feet. I sipped coffee at the small cafe near the harbor, flipping through old novels I had meant to read for years. I smiled at neighbors whose names I was just learning, waved at the fishermen who nodded respectfully without prying into my life. There was a profound liberation in choosing silence. I didn't owe anyone a story. I didn't owe anyone an explanation for my freedom, for the decisions I had made behind closed doors with only my own well-being in mind. I had spent decades of my life explaining myself to others, justifying my choices, softening my edges, offering context for every deviation from what was expected of me. I was tired of that endless, exhausting translation. If they chose to see me as cruel, as selfish, as reckless, that was their burden to carry, not mine. My hands had already let go of it. Occasionally, there were moments of temptation, moments when I thought about writing a letter, carefully laying out the history they had conveniently forgotten, the hours and years I had given without asking for anything in return, the patience I had extended, the forgiveness I had offered, the loyalty I had poured out until the well inside me ran dry. I imagined spelling it out plainly, how their visits and calls had turned transactional, how their affection had become conditional on my compliance. But every time I thought of sending such a letter, of having that final word, a calm voice inside me said, no, they would not understand. They did not want the truth. They wanted permission to keep seeing me the way it suited them, and I would not give it to them. Instead, I answered their texts with short, polite replies when I felt inclined. Thank you for your concern. I'm well. I hope you are too. I said nothing more. I did not explain the sale. I did not explain the move. I did not explain the silence between us growing wider with each passing day. Kevin tried once more to visit in person, showing up on a Saturday morning with a box of pastries and a tight, eager smile. I opened the door just enough to step onto the porch, leaving the house locked behind me. I thanked him for the pastries, refused his invitation to sit down and talk about everything, and wished him a good day. I didn't invite him inside. I didn't soften the boundaries I had set. He stood there for a long moment, stunned, caught off guard by the new version of me. The version that did not bend, did not yield, did not explain. I waited until he turned and walked back to his car, the box of pastries dangling awkwardly from his hand, before I returned inside and closed the door behind me with a final satisfying click. That afternoon, I packed away the last remnants of the past I had no intention of revisiting. Family photos that once lined the mantelpiece were carefully wrapped and placed in a cedar chest at the back of my closet, not because I hated them, not because I wanted to erase them, but because they no longer needed to be displayed to prove anything to anyone. The love that had been real between us once was still sacred to me, but I refused to pretend it was still alive when it had long since been replaced by expectation and obligation. My home became lighter, cleaner, a space entirely of my choosing. I filled it with things that brought me quiet joy, wildflowers gathered on morning walks, old records playing soft jazz in the evenings, hand-woven rugs that warmed the floors under my bare feet. I stopped waiting for their understanding. I stopped hoping for their approval. I stopped carrying the weight of their disappointment. The silence that grew between us was no longer a void to be feared. It was a landscape I had chosen to inhabit, one where every word I spoke, every step I took, belonged to me alone. There is a power in refusing to explain yourself to people who have already decided what they want to believe. There is a peace in standing firm in the quiet, in letting the noise of their confusion and judgment wash over you without breaching the walls you have built to protect yourself. I had found that peace, and I intended to keep it. The deeper I moved into my new life, the more I realized how long it had been since I had made a choice that was purely for myself, not for appearances, not for duty, not to maintain peace or to meet expectations, but for the simple, radical reason that it made me happy. It was both exhilarating and unfamiliar, like stepping into sunlight after spending too long in a dim room. There were no more obligations chaining my days to someone else's agenda. No one dropped by unannounced with veiled judgments wrapped in polite smiles. No one hovered over my decisions with thinly disguised disapproval. My time belonged to me now, each moment unfolding as a canvas I could paint however I wished. One of the first choices I made was to change the way I spent my mornings. Instead of rising with a sense of duty, chores to do, calls to return, appearances to maintain, I rose with curiosity. I brewed my coffee slowly, letting the rich smell fill the kitchen, and then I took it outside to the small patio where I had placed a new rocking chair, one I had chosen simply because it made me smile. I wrapped myself in a shawl, listened to the hush of the early hours, and watched the way the sun climbed lazily into the sky, gilding the edges of everything it touched. Sometimes I read, losing myself in novels that had nothing to do with self-improvement or obligation. Sometimes I simply sat, letting my mind wander wherever it pleased, without guilt or purpose. It felt strange at first, this stillness without an underlying current of expectation, but gradually I grew into it, like a plant turning toward the light. I began taking long drives along the coast, windows down, the salty air whipping through the car. I stopped whenever the mood struck me, at a roadside market selling fresh peaches, at a rocky overlook where the sea battered itself against the cliffs, at a tiny antique shop cluttered with forgotten treasures. I spent hours wandering through those places, not searching for anything, just letting myself be pulled by whim and wonder. I took up painting, even though I had no particular talent for it. I bought a set of inexpensive watercolors and thick paper and spent rainy afternoons at my kitchen table, brushing bold, messy colors across the page. I didn't care if the results were good. It wasn't about creating something beautiful for others to admire. It was about giving myself permission to play, to experiment, to create without fear of failure. I signed up for a poetry reading at the local library, even though the idea of standing in front of strangers made my hands tremble. I wrote about the sea and the wind and the bittersweet ache of letting go, and when I read my words aloud, I felt something inside me settle, like a ship finding safe harbor after a long, stormy journey. I chose friendships carefully now. I let go of the notion that I had to maintain every relationship simply because of history or obligation. I surrounded myself with people who saw me as I was now, not as I had been, not as they wanted me to be. We shared meals and laughter, long conversations and comfortable silences. There was no keeping score, no hidden transactions masked as affection, just the quiet, steady warmth of being known and accepted. I made a garden in the small backyard behind my new home, planting herbs and wildflowers and sturdy vegetables. I tended it with bare hands and bare feet, feeling the dirt cool and crumbling between my fingers. It grew wild and tangled, defying neat rows and tidy borders, and I loved it all the more for its stubbornness. It mirrored the life I was building, a little unruly, entirely mine. The calls and texts from my old life slowed over time, tapering off like a storm running out of rain. At first, I wondered if I should feel grief, if the silence left behind should weigh heavy on my heart. But instead, it felt like the opening of a window long painted shut, the rush of fresh air into lungs starved for breath. I did not miss the half-hearted conversations, the obligations disguised as affection. I missed only what had never truly been there. In choosing myself, I was not rejecting love. I was rejecting the idea that love had to be earned by sacrificing my peace. I was rejecting the belief that my worth depended on how much of myself I could give away. I was choosing a life where joy was not a reward for endurance, but the natural fruit of living honestly. And in doing so, I discovered a truth so simple it stunned me. Happiness does not ask for permission. It does not wait for approval. It blooms wherever it is planted with care and courage. I had planted mine here, in this quiet, sunlit life, and it was beginning to blossom in ways I had never dared imagine. Freedom did not arrive all at once, like a crashing wave or a triumphant drumbeat. It crept in quietly, like the tide sliding over the sand, reshaping the shore in small, patient strokes. Some days it announced itself in obvious ways. A morning when I realized I had nowhere I needed to be, no one expecting anything from me. Other days it whispered in the background, woven into the easy rhythm of a life finally lived on my own terms. I woke when my body told me to, not to the shrill summons of an alarm clock or the unspoken demands of others. I cooked when I was hungry, sometimes elaborate meals, sometimes simple sandwiches eaten barefoot on the porch. I filled my days with books, with music, with the slow, satisfying work of tending my garden and walking by the ocean, letting the salty wind untangle the knots that had lived in my chest for years. Freedom meant I no longer second-guessed my choices. I bought a wide-brimmed hat I didn't need because it made me feel like a character from one of the novels I loved. I took long drives without a destination, letting the road decide where I ended up. I sat alone in cafes, savoring the hush of my own company without feeling the old pang of needing to be somewhere else, doing something more productive. Freedom meant understanding that I didn't owe explanations for my happiness or my solitude. When acquaintances asked why I had sold the house, why I had moved, why I seemed so different now, I simply smiled and said it was time for a change. I did not tell them about the silent calculations behind their supposed concerns, the plans drawn up in the corners of my life without my consent. I did not explain how long it had taken me to recognize the difference between love and control. Some truths belonged only to me. The people who had once hovered so closely around me gradually drifted away, not out of cruelty, but because I no longer played the role they had cast for me. Without the familiar dance of guilt and obligation to anchor them, they lost interest. At first, the absences felt like small aches, bruises pressing against old wounds. But over time, I realized they were gifts, empty spaces where new life could grow. I filled those spaces with laughter, with silence, with small adventures. I took up photography, not with any goal of mastery, but simply to capture the light as it spilled across the water or caught in the petals of wildflowers. I spent afternoons sitting on the rocky bluffs, letting the ocean's endless rhythm remind me that change was the only constant worth trusting. Freedom tasted like coffee sipped slowly under a sky blooming with stars. It sounded like the sharp cry of seagulls overhead, the creak of my porch swing, the pages of a book turning in the quiet. It looked like my bare feet pressed into warm sand, like the wild sprawl of my garden reaching for the sun without permission. It felt like breathing, deeply and fully, without fear that someone might call me selfish for choosing to be whole. Sometimes I thought about the life I had left behind, not with bitterness, but with a kind of detached tenderness. It was a life built on duty, on love that asked too much and gave too little in return. I honored it for what it had taught me, even as I closed the door firmly behind me. I no longer needed to belong to a version of myself that others found comfortable. I belonged to the woman I had become, strong, gentle, fiercely tender with the parts of herself that had been neglected for too long. I carved out new rituals that honored the person I was now. Sunday mornings spent on the beach, watching the horizon burn gold with the rising sun. Evenings spent writing letters to myself, letters of forgiveness, letters of gratitude, letters of promises kept, and dreams still waiting to unfold. No one told me how to spend my days. No one demanded explanations for my joy. No one measured my worth by my willingness to sacrifice it for their convenience. I had stripped away every expectation, every silent obligation, every invisible leash. What remained was a life stripped bare and rebuilt from the marrow out. My freedom was not loud or dramatic. It was a quiet, steady hum that lived in my bones. It was the peace that settled over me when I locked the door at night, knowing I answered only to myself. It was the certainty that whatever came next, whatever joys, whatever griefs, whatever ordinary miracles. The choices would be mine. And that was enough. That would always be enough.